It's time to feel what you've been bottling up. Life in rural America isn't easy. The long hours, the constant pressures, the demands of the land, livestock, and family, it all takes a toll. We're tough and we've got grit, but somewhere along the way, toughness started meaning bottling up emotions and powering through. But here's the truth. That strategy, it's not working and it's poisoning us. Maybe you've noticed and maybe you haven't, but the numbers don't lie. We're breaking down and it's showing up in our bodies, our relationships, and in the rising suicide rates in agriculture. You don't have to carry any of it alone. There's another way. If you're ready to stop being weighed down and start moving forward, my one-on-one Good Movement guidance is now open. Visit the link in the show notes to learn more and see if one-on-one guidance could be for you.
I'll carry you, you carry me, we'll help each other through it. Come on and see Good Movement draws good movement.
Welcome to Good Movement Draws Good Movement, the podcast where farmers, ranchers, and rural folks can grow relationally through awareness, understanding, and effective communication. Hey, it's T. I'm your host, and I, along with my guests, will be covering topics related to drawing good movement. Things like self and social awareness, brain science, positive psychology, extending grace, and so much more. We'll share tools that can help you understand why you are the way you are, why others are the way they are, and how you can use that to step out of self-told lies with grace and compassion to draw good movement in conversations, relationships, and life in rural America. Let's go draw good movement. Welcome back to the Good Movement Draws Good Movement podcast. If you've been following along the last few weeks, then you know that we've been diving into the power of validation. We've talked about what validation is, why it's important, what it's not, and how to give and receive it. In today's episode, we're talking about one of the hardest times to practice validation during tough conversations when emotions run high. We all know how easily things can go sideways when we're in the middle of a heated discussion, whether it's on the ranch, in the family business, in our day-to-day lives, or our personal relationships. It can feel impossible to validate someone else when your own emotions are in overdrive and or aren't being validated. So today, we're going to talk about how to stay grounded and keep the lines of communication open, even when things get tense. High stakes equal high emotions. When the stakes are high, especially in our rural lives, in farming and ranching, emotions can tend to flare up. The stress from the long hours that we put in, the financial pressures, the weather, generational expectations, the list could go on, but all of these things can heighten tension. Using Tom and I as an example, our last big fight, the one we talked about in episode 15, happened last spring after the cows got out into the wrong pasture. And while we were putting them away, they broke a gate and got into a second wrong pasture. This whole thing resulted in some yelling, walking home. And, if there's yelling and walking home, there has to be high emotion. And there was. So these situations like them can easily slip into emotional reactions and conflict because of a number of things: unspoken expectations, pressure from time constraints. Again, the list could go on. But in our case, the fight broke out because we both had slightly different ideas on how to get the cows back in, and neither one of us voiced those to each other. So unspoken expectations. And while I wouldn't say there were time constraints that day, we did go out there thinking that we were just going to do a leisurely check of the cows. And instead, we found them out and had way too many dogs with us for that job. Anyway, one thing led to another. There was yelling. Emotions ran high. there was some walking home. So, how can we keep these moments from spiraling into conflict? The first step is staying grounded. To stay grounded, we can do a couple of things. We can pause before responding. Essentially, think before you speak, sort of thing. Maybe somebody is in the wrong spot during sorting or they've been continually in the wrong spot and you are at your wit's end and you're about to yell. In this moment, take a deep breath, wait a beat. And it's amazing how just a few seconds can change the whole tone of the conversation. Once you have taken that pause, taken your deep breath, I'm telling you, breath work is life-changing. It's definitely conversation changing. It gives you a moment to calm down. Pausing allows you to regulate your emotions. Remember, emotions are not meant to stick with us. They can move through our bodies in as quick as 90 seconds if we allow them to come in, say hello, and leave. When we pause, we can regulate our own emotions, and then we can respond from a calm, thoughtful place instead of reacting in the heat of the moment, yelling, having our help yell back at us, or having them leave. That's also happened with Tom and I. I was the one that left. And wouldn't you know it, he got the job done without me. The second thing we can do to help ground ourselves is breathe and check in with ourselves. This is similar to taking pause before we respond because we're going to take a deep breath, but we're physically going to ground ourselves by touching something like the fence or our saddle or whatever, our horse, whatever it is, or just like feeling our feet on the ground. I myself like to focus on something or notice something, be more mindful of my surroundings. And then I take the deep breath and focus on where I am in the here and now. It sounds really silly, I know, but trust me on this, it does help. And not only does this help you regulate your emotions in heated situations, but it also makes you just generally more aware. You start to notice things that you wouldn't normally notice or you haven't noticed in the past. And so that's a beautiful thing too. Grounding yourself physically by touching something or seeing something or hearing something or feeling the wind on your face can help lower the emotional response or the heat of the moment. It can take the temperature down on the heat of the moment, and it gives you space to engage thoughtfully. So when we're feeling emotional and our emotions are running wild, it can be hard to not only validate others, but also just validate ourselves. In those moments, it can be helpful if we acknowledge the emotion. And by the emotion, I mean all the emotion, yours and theirs. If we can name our own feelings and acknowledge the other person's feelings, even in a tense moment, that can be so incredibly helpful. You might say something like, I can see we're both frustrated right now, but I still want to hear you. This shows the other person that you're recognizing the emotion, what's happening within you, what's happening within them, but you're not letting it control the conversation. And when emotions are acknowledged, they lose some of their power to send us off the rails or send our conversation off the rails. It also shows the other person that you're still committed to understanding them. Another thing that we can do in those heated moments when we need to validate, but we are also emotional, is use neutral, calm language. In order to do this, you're probably going to have to bring in some of the pause before you respond and grounding yourself. But instead of saying, why didn't you listen? You can reframe it with, I'm wondering if there was some confusion about where you needed to be. That opens it up to where you can ask an honest question and you can get feedback from the person. The neutral language prevents escalation. when you're using neutral language, it's not just about the words you say, but also the tone in which you say them. And so that's where it becomes really important to pause and breathe and ground yourself so you're regulated, so you can use truly neutral language. This neutral language keeps the focus on solving the problem rather than attacking the person. I like to say, which I picked up from a book, and I think the book was Rare Leadership in the Workplace, but you want to keep the relationship bigger than the problem. And that can be where neutral language comes in very handy. Now, again, this isn't just about purely validation with no boundaries. We need to be able to balance validation and boundaries in relationships, at work, in our homes, etc. Validating someone's feelings does not mean you have to agree with their actions or their perspective. And I would argue that you don't even necessarily have to understand another person's feelings or actions or perspective in order to validate them. But we can validate without agreeing. An example of this is saying something like, I understand you're upset that we're making these changes in operation, but here's why I think it's necessary. I think a lot of times we forget to clue people into our inner workings, like going back to the example of mine and Tom's fight over the cows that were out. Both of us had different ideas, different and equally as good and probably as effective ideas about how to get the cows back in, but neither one of us spoke them. And when we finally did, we were both like, aha. And so this opens up an opportunity for you to share something maybe you haven't shared before and give people like insider information into what you're thinking. So I understand you're upset that we're making these changes on the operation, but here's why I think it's necessary. You're acknowledging their feelings without compromising your stance. This shows that validation doesn't mean giving up on your own boundaries or beliefs. It's just about being respectful of both sides. In the heat of the moment, you can also choose right then and there to set a boundary calmly. We can do this by saying, I get that you're upset, but I'm not okay with yelling. Let's take a step back and talk about this when we're calmer. This sets the boundary without dismissing the other person's emotions. And honestly, boundaries, if you haven't listened to the episode on boundaries, I can't remember what number it is, but there's an episode about boundaries. Boundaries are kind. Boundaries protect both parties from escalating the conflict while still acknowledging the emotional space of the conversation or the emotion in the conversation. And so depending on what the situation is and who you're talking to or who you're trying to set the boundary with, it might not be very well received and the yelling might continue. And in that case, you absolutely have the right to exit the conversation completely. Leaving until things can calm down is another example of a boundary. And you can say, again, I get that you're upset, but I am not okay with the yelling. And if we can't figure out a way to proceed calmly, I'm going to have to leave. And there again, it's protecting both of you and acknowledging the emotion in the room or pasture or sword alley. Today, we've covered some essential tips for validating others during tough conversations, i.e. staying grounded, naming emotions, using neutral language, and setting boundaries. I want to challenge you to try some of this out the next time you find yourself in a tense situation, whether it's on the ranch or in your personal relationships. It might just make all the difference. But I also want to challenge you to practice this tool of validation before you actually need to implement it in real life. How to do this, how to practice validation, practice on yourself. The next time that you are feeling something, don't say, oh, shove it down. I got work to do. I need to shove this down. I don't have time to feel this. Just pause and say, Man, I'm feeling really anxious. What is that about? This concludes our series on validation. If you have any questions or comments or examples of times that you have used what you learned in these episodes about validation, I would love to hear them. So you can shoot me a DM over on Instagram or send me an email. My email is in the show notes. And with that, until next time, draw a good movement. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so grateful for you. If you found value in this episode, I'd love for you to share with others who might also benefit from tuning in. Share by word of mouth, send it in a text, take a screenshot and post it on social media, or share however you prefer. And if you haven't already, hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Until next time, draw good movement.